Good afternoon. I know we'll have a few more people coming in, but for the sake of time and for the sake of our presentations, we'll get the ball rolling with our final presenter. The one thing I will say about this conference is you can tell there's been a whole pile of different opportunities about learning and education from all different realms of real estate. The one thing I like to take for granted is the opportunity to learn. And I think for our sake here, seeing all the different breakouts, all the different panelists, all the different groups, it's been a phenomenal presentation. And every single year, I think we keep getting better. And finally, for our last keynote presentation, I could not think of a better presenter than DJ Van Kuren. Now, hear me out with this. As we kind of pick through our keynotes, we're looking for different areas of real estate. And I'll be the first one to admit when I don't know something. And I think it's kind of like the deer in the headlights type of look. I get on the phone with DJ. I've been following him for LinkedIn on a little while. I've found a few of you have emailed me his contact info, his names. And he starts talking like he's got a beautiful mind. I'm like, okay, I need you to get you here. I need what you need. I need to know what you know because it will truly make a difference for our state and for the stakeholders of this state. And so is a warm welcome from me to introduce DJ. What's one thing cool about this is he's talking about what he wants to present on. I don't know what he's, I'm like, no man, that's not for me, okay? But I do know this. One beautiful thing that I have is I know a few people who would fit this bill perfectly. And so, as DJ will present today, the last 20 so minutes or so, he's going to call up a couple of the audience members. Don't worry, I've already warned you. So if you did not speak to me, you won't have to worry about getting called up. But he's going to call him up and talk a little bit about the future of real estate. So please give a warm welcome to DJ Van Kuren.
Thanks, Ryan. Is there a clock around here?
I think it's right here.
Okay, good. All right, well, thank you very much. I've been looking very much forward to being up here. And, after Ryan first reached out to me, I did a little research because I didn't know a lot about South Dakota State University. And after going through it, I was definitely impressed. And so I'm very happy to be here as a whole. So, I've got my real estate background really started in 2003. And like Ryan was just saying, I asked him, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, well, you can choose what you want to talk about. Just like he said. So I'm going to tell you my process of how this whole thing happened. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm really known and been focused on the family office real estate industry. I could talk about families, right? I mean, I've worked for some major families, some of which you probably have heard of before. Founders of Giorgio Perfume, Giorgio Beverly Hills, created a boutique office brand strategy, which is actually doing quite well. Did some work for my first billionaire out of Colorado, most analytical real estate guy I have ever met. Just truly amazing. Then did some work with one of the owners of Major League Baseball team, and then ended up saying I've been asked from a lot of families to help them with their real estate investments, formed a company. The first family started doing work with, and we still are, the Marriotts. And so I'm like, okay, we could talk about that. And when you look at families too, our definition is we're 250 million or more. And total in the whole world, it's about 17,000 families, and they have about $10 trillion. Now, over the next 10 to 20 years, that's going to grow to about 65 trillion. Average allocation is 24.5%. That's about 11 trillion going into real estate. And the problems they have, I'm like, okay, we can talk about the problems that they've had because 70% of families lose their wealth by the second gen, 90% by the third. And it's real. I had somebody come in one time into my office and he goes, hey, I go, how you doing? He goes, well, not so good. I just lost 80% of my family's money. 80%? So he tells me it's a real estate deal in New Jersey. And so I had to ask him, how much was that? 800 million. I'm like, oh my gosh, just give me 1 million, I'll be okay. And 800 million, right? So I was going to talk about families, but now I'm going to talk about something else. Well, what else could I talk about? Well, I could talk about market cycles. And, you know, you can go back 250 years. And there's a trend in the US, Australia, and the UK. An 18-year cycle. So I'm going to go on the record right now, and I have been for years, that we are not going to see a recession until 28 or 29. If you look at what's happening in the multifamily industry, there's a lot of opportunity, but the demand is there. We've still got a good 5 years of demand for that type of housing, right? So we can go through, I'm like, okay, I can go through all the cycles. No, I said, I'm not going to talk about that. So then I call Ryan back, and he goes, I asked him again, what do you want me to talk about? Do you want to interview me? Whatever you want to do. You can talk about anything you want to. So I said, okay, well, maybe I'll go back to my past and see what I've learned and everything else. And then I went back to 2003. And that's when I started. And came back from Asia, and I put together that I positioned to be the first single-family REIT. So we're buying single-family homes, and everybody now knows about single-family REITs, right? And Blackstone and the big boys. Well, at the time, I'm going around, I'm trying to educate bankers and lenders on blanket mortgages. And they're looking at me like, what are you talking about? Well, today, you can get loans for hundreds of millions of dollars on houses. But at the time, you couldn't, right? So there's been that evolution. You go up to the recession. Now, fortunately, I did sell because I did dive in the market cycle, so I got out before that happened, went back to grad school. And then you go into the recession. And when you look at who was involved and who's historically been in real estate, the major people in real estate, they usually started at the bottom, historically. Started as a broker, as a lender. Maybe they're on the finance side. And then they move their way up, right, to where they're at the top. Well, when you start looking into 2008, all of a sudden you start having all these MBAs come in. Starting to be more institutional. Personally, I think that was one of the demises to what happened in the industry, because you had a lot of people that were number crunchers, but they didn't understand hard assets. They didn't understand the real, tangible part of real estate. But it continues to evolve. And so, as I was going through it, I'm like, okay, well, Ryan's giving me this again, I gotta figure out what I'm going to talk about. I'm like, well, there's an evolution there. That is changing. And then I'm like, well, a couple of years ago, I've been fortunate to speak at different places around the world, and they asked me to talk about really the future of real estate. And I said to myself, I said, okay, I know nothing about that. But then I said, well, here's an opportunity to learn, to see what happens. And when I did that, I looked at it, and some of you might do it today, but I literally said, holy shit. I could not believe what was happening. And things are happening faster and faster all the time. Especially with technology. Does anybody remember what it was like with AOL when you plugged in your phone? Right? And you hear that noise, and then you hear, you got mail. And everybody's like, yeah. Well, I know the students today are like, what are you talking about? Right? Because we can talk about the rotary dials and everything else, but think about if we did that. Look how fast that's grown. How fast the internet is today. Can you imagine if we asked the students to sit down in front of a dial-up? How long do you think it takes? We thought it was fast if it took like 2 minutes. Probably took like 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Well, things are changing all the time, and real estate is definitely part of that. So, and it can definitely be for the better. The question is that are you going to get ahead of this thing, or are you going to wait for it to happen? So let's look at the mortgage industry. It's labor intensive. Do we have any mortgage people in here? Okay, so you probably know all this, right? There's countless intermediaries, third party involved. separate ledgers, incompatible systems. How long does it take to close a mortgage? 30, 45 days, 60 days, right? Lack of visibility or knowledge of the transaction because you have so many parties. It's highly efficient, but it's repetitive. You're doing a loan, you're doing the same thing over and over again, right? In fact, in 2022, 11.7 million applications were done in mortgages. Let's say there's an average of 200 pages per transaction. And sometimes you can keep it less, but it could be up to 7 years. That's about 16 billion pages. That's a lot of trees, right? About 10% of the cost of your total transaction. I mean, it's quite a bit. Look at appraisals. You know that you guys, you've got classes for appraisals and whatnot. You have challenges that come up from data gathering, paperwork, documentation, manual calculations, limited transparency, authentication of documents, regulatory compliance. You couple that in with fragmented data as a whole in the industry, right? And it's always been fragmented, and that's been one of the benefits of real estate. That's why you'd always hear local, because you have that local knowledge, you have that local understanding. But when you break it down, it's very, very inefficient, right? So if you look at the various components that you're dealing with, an owner, you've got a bank, right? Consultants, repair companies, tenant, investors, insurance companies, facility managers, notaries, appraisers, financiers, lawyers, portfolio managers. There's a lot of paper there. There's a lot happening. Not a lot of people talking necessarily. And it can take a long time to close a transaction, right? But where there's opportunity, because it's fragmented, there's also challenges. And real estate historically has been behind the curve of any advances. So what's the solution for this? Blockchain is one of them. Everybody heard of blockchain before? One of those words that keep coming up, right? So let's talk about the origin of blockchain really quickly. And this, my friends, is a game changer for real estate. So when you look at it, it really came out of the financial crisis of 2008. Because afterward, people were taking their money, not wanting to put their money in the bank, right? And so around the same time, cryptocurrency started to come into play. In fact, 2009, they think it's Satoshi Nakamoto. They're not sure exactly, but they believe that is his actual name, came out with Bitcoin. And he created blockchain technology in order to handle the cryptocurrencies because he wanted to make sure there was a solution that was being taken care of, which is called a double spending pattern, where the money could go to multiple places and you don't even know who has it, right? So because of that, he came up with blockchain. So it really came out of cryptocurrency, which is to help streamline that process. So I'm going to give you an example of blockchain here, and then I'm going to show you how it's relative to the real estate industry. So think of blockchain like a book. I want to make sure everybody is on a page, right? So the book is blockchain. The blank page would be a block. Each entry on the page is a transaction. So when you go through the book, it should be page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, right? However, what happens if somebody rips out a page and there's missing? Well, one, it's hard possibly to read the rest of the story. But two, you can tell if it's missing, if a sentence is taken out, if it's changed, right? And so that's an example where blockchain can help with that. Make sure that those pages always remain the same, that you don't have those gaps. So let's look at real estate. So there's a house that's built in 1976. It's sold to owner one. In 1980, there's an improvement on the house. You have an approved extension in 1980, sold to the owner in 1989, failed an inspection in 91. Seller sells it to the third owner, puts in a $50,000 investment, and there's an electrical fire in 2001. So you want the history of this house? Well, unfortunately, new chimney was put in there. Didn't talk about any failed inspection. But when you have blockchain, it locks everything in where all that information is immutable, can't be changed. So now you have transparency. Now you know exactly what's going on, right? And it speeds up that whole process. It's going to transform real estate tremendously. One is going to be decentralizing MLS. Tokenized ownership, already happened. Smart contracts. Airbnb. Preventing title fraud. Crowdfunding investing. Wire fraud. Inspection transparency. Fighting mortgage fraud, which anybody that is in the mortgage industry, it's real. It does happen. And also title. So let's talk about the ecosystem. So there's traditional and smart contracts. And I'm going to have a couple people locally come up here. We'll talk about this. And one of the conversations Eric mentioned had to do with smart contracts. And this is one of the ways it's going to streamline the system. So if you have a traditional contract, it usually takes 1 to 3 days. With a smart contract, you can do it in minutes, similar to a DocuSign. Manual remittance for traditional contacts, where it automatically happens. Escrows, necessary and traditional, may not be necessary. In smart contracts, expensive, fraction of the cost for smart contracts. Physical, wet signature, typically required where you can have a digital signature. Lawyers are necessary. And for those lawyers in the room, which I think one of them I'm going to be talking with, so I have to be careful. The lawyers may not be necessary. So now what happens is you take that transaction from a mortgage 30, 45, 60 days, and it's done in a matter of seconds. Everything can happen together. So how they work is you agree to the terms and conditions. You execute the contract. It's executed automatically. And the smart contract is settled. So what does that look like in real life application? Well, let's look at from a rental apartment perspective, right? You're able to go through, get the keys, and actually, you can take out real estate brokers, lawyers, notaries, the middlemen. What about if we did a commercial lease? What would that look like? Well, you have the MLS, right? Property search through blockchain enabled MLS. Visit the property, inspect it, which you're always going to have to do. Negotiate, sign the term of the letter. Pre-lease due diligence documents by using smart identities, background checks, preparation of the agreement, lease agreement with the smart contracts, and then you have real-time data. So where does the blockchain come in this? Number 1, number 4, number 6, number 7, number 8. Speeding up that whole process considerably. What about a purchase and sale? You got to look for the property, right? Underwrite, always financially evaluate it. Set up a property visit with the brokers, Go over the MOU, pre-purchase due diligence, review, final signing, and then the execution of the sale. And here, blockchain is used in first one, second one, 5, 6, 7. Once again, streamlining that whole process. And blockchain is being used not just occasionally, but it's actually being around the world. Many times the U.S. isn't the leader when it comes to creativity or trying to get ahead of the curve. And this is one example. Because the European Union made a declaration, and they formed the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure and the Blockchain Partnership. This was born out of 2018, and there's 29 countries, all EU members, that are a part of this. And when you looked at this, they also put together $80 million invested in the project, supporting the use of blockchain. And then a further $300 million was to be allocated in 2020. You know, earlier we were talking about how the states and municipalities really don't speak. I mean, this is really what we need. We need to have some type of an organization where everybody really comes together to take advantage of this. In the U.S., we have made some progress. Land and title registries, they're managed by individual municipalities, and other cities are exploring blockchain. Here, there's some work being done. South Burlington, they have a recently launched pilot program. You know, there is an imperfect system of real property records. And in the private sector, things are starting to happen. There's banks that are coming together. Goldman Sachs, Blackstone, Morgan Stanley are coming together to create a coin. And so things are moving forward. There's still a long way to go with this whole thing. Regulatory hurdles, lack of understanding of the technology and how it works. What about cryptocurrency? We talked about that before. Well, the first transaction was actually done in Vermont. This was by a company in 2018 called Proppy. They're out of San Francisco. And they did the whole transaction with blockchain and cryptocurrency in Vermont. This was a significant milestone for it to be done. I'm not sure how many more transactions they've done since then, but they showed that it worked and how it could work. And fintech companies are increasing. I was doing some work with an investment bank when I lived in New York, and a guy comes in and he's pitching to the crowd, and the principal I was with, he starts talking about what he's going to do with all this technology and real estate. And I looked at my principal, and he's just staring off into space, and I'm like, oh my God. Well, has anybody heard of Reonomy? You may have or may not have heard of Reonomy. They're primarily out of New York City. What they did is he took all these data points and he brought it together to identify who owned each building, who had a lease coming up, who was the owners of the LLCs, and how it tracked all the way back through. I mean, just amazing information. And it's happening more and more with this technology. If you look at companies that are coming to market all the time, and money's being given to these people too as well. In 2017, there was $12.6 billion that were invested in this. When you fast forward to 2021, $32 billion. Trying to make changes to make this more efficient and easier. And it's projected to continue to grow. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier that's happening, unfortunately, is they have a lot of tech guys that don't understand real estate. And so you've got to make sure that those are being matched. Currently in 2023, its funding's come down a little bit with all the other equity as well. So it's significantly lower, but it's continuing looking to grow. So what data can be on the blockchain? Well, plans and models can all go on the blockchain, historical data. due diligence, legislative data, technical data, financial data, contract data, valuation, master data. So a lot of the information can go on the blockchain and really streamline everything. And then you have the tokenization of property. Has anybody heard about tokenization or invested into any tokens or property? Currently sit on the board of Red Swan, and they've gone through the whole FINRA registration and everything else. And basically, the way I explain it to people, if they're not aware, it's basically crowdfunding using cryptocurrency. I mean, that's really what it is. The first one that was done, it was in St. Regis in Aspen. There was a REIT, owned by a REIT. They did an IPO, and then they changed. And they said, look, we're going to go through and offer close to 19% ownership into it. So they created a coin, their own coin, in order to do this. And they ended up getting investors all around the world. Dollar a coin, they're purchased in US dollars, Bitcoin, Ether. So this is happening. And more people are wanting to do this. I was at the Hoyt Institute speaking a number of weeks ago, and Prudential is over in Singapore working with all these companies that they're going to tokenize their portfolio of real estate, wanting to do it with tokens. So the big boys are starting to get into that, and when the big boys start doing that, then everybody will start following suit, which is going to, once again, speed up the whole process. But there's benefits for this blockchain for real estate, by all means. You've got the smart contracts we talked about, right? Immutable records, which is significant. Tokenization. Streamlining cross-border transactions. The world's getting smaller and smaller, and it's going to continue in real estate. Reduce cost, improve speed, data privacy, accessibility, enhanced trust, improved efficiency, increased transparency, provide new investment opportunities. How can appraisers benefit from blockchain? Well, automated data aggregation, right? Digital records, smart contracts, increased transparency, instantaneous reports and transfer, regulatory compliance, global standards, comparables, fraud prevention, resource allocation, storing appraisal data, sharing data, tracking appraisals, automated appraisal tasks, improve efficiency. I would imagine that the classes that you're taking for appraisals will be changing a little bit. Land registry, another area, right? Providing multiple parties can update their property, title matters immediately. Databases can hold on to all the transactions and can be updated near instantaneously. And this is really important because 25% of all titles during the transaction process has defects. So this streamlines, once again, the whole process. The only thing about this is that it is going to have an impact on jobs. And this was one of the aha moments that I had when I initially went through this. Because it's going to impact jobs in the construction industry, real estate financing, banks, appraisals, brokerage for lawyers, title insurance companies, and the list goes on. But what are the future opportunities? And this is big for students, and Ryan and I were talking about this. Because the question is can you get ahead of it? My daughter just recently graduated with her animation degree. I'm very proud of her. She's one of those limited people that knew what she wanted to do when she was 10 years old. So now she wants to work for Rick and Morty or Family Guy, so I'm supporting that now that she's graduated. But there's a writer's strike happening right now. They're starting to lay people off in animation. And she's like, oh my gosh, AI is going to kill this whole thing. They're not going to need me. AI is going to do it all. It's going to do everything. Well, that's not true. It's at least not going to happen tomorrow. And that's the same thing in the real estate. It's going to be a lot of the same things that's needed to be done, but it has to be done differently. And it really comes down to taking advantage of what is being provided through AI or blockchain, tokenization, and once again, getting ahead. So some of the future jobs would be a real estate tokenized specialist, overseeing the process of converting real estate assets into digital tokens. Smart contract developer for real estates, creating, testing, implementing smart contracts to automate that whole process, escrow, title changes. Blockchain compliance analyst, making sure that all the transactions are working with the local, state, federal laws. Auditor, specializing in reviewing and verifying blockchain transactions. Decentralized finance mortgage broker, that's a mouthful. But facilitating the mortgages, that might be your future if you're doing mortgages, right? Digital land registrar, blockchain real estate consultant, crypto realtor, data analyst for real estate decentralized autonomous organization manager, right? Managing, coordinating all the decentralized organizations, compliance analyst, blockchain experience manager, token economic strategist, and lastly, education, which is ironic. We just had that conversation, right? Now, to do this, they are going to require a mix of expertise in real estate, finance, law, and technology. But the job descriptions are going to change. The jobs themselves are going to change. And it will revolutionize everything. Transactions will be going across the world simultaneously. One of the biggest things that people like about tokenization is that you have liquidity, which to me, I don't think is a great thing. That's one of the benefits of real estate, that it can help you not sell from emotions, because you can't get rid of it right away like stocks. And how many people have lost money in the market because they got emotional? My unfortunate story was I bought Amazon for $12 a share, and I think I sold it at 15. So I try not to calculate those numbers. But all of this is going to make us smaller and smaller. The whole world doing transactions with each other. And that's why it's important that you get ahead and you understand and you listen to see what's happening, because blockchain, cryptocurrency definitely is changing all parts of real estate. It has the potential to revolutionize the way real estate sectors operates. And the World Economic Forum, I don't think you can say it better, but it will be the beating heart of the global financial system. The good thing is that things are happening in local areas. And I'd like to bring up a couple people that are actually dealing with that and to talk a little bit more about what's happening. And so if I could have Eric, if you could come up here for a minute, that'd be great. Eric Hansen, Dakota Homestead, and Barry. Barry here? He'll be, where is he? Holy cow. Okay, well then I'm going to start with you. How's this sound? So Eric, we were talking a little bit before about what you guys are doing. So tell me a little bit about, first off, what you guys do, how blockchain fits in, and the steps you guys have been taking.
So I would say, DJ, when it comes to dealing with anything to do with blockchain, especially in the title industry side, you're talking to someone who oversees one of the smallest title insurance underwriters in the country. So instead of being on the, push for trying to develop that technology, it's for understanding. We deal with, in our industry, our South Dakota Land Title Association, what we have is primarily made up of small, locally owned title companies instead of, more national ones. So it's an attempt to try and figure out what some of these developments are in the world of blockchain as it relates to real estate, to pass that information on so we can be aware of it. And where we've kind of seen that is 3 different waves that we're kind of seeing on the real estate industry side for what goes into it. You know, back starting 2018 was the big push of, are you going to accept cryptocurrency to pay for a real estate transaction? And that was at a national level. You know, you have the start of some title companies, you know, in Vermont, Florida, New York, California, that started accepting cryptocurrency as a form of payment that they worked on with the buyers, the sellers on their settlement service to say, we're valuing it at this dollar amount on this date. So when you purchase a property and you pay for it in a type of cryptocurrency, that you can use that the same as cash coming into the transaction, and then how you distribute that for what gets involved. Locally, that hasn't happened, but it's something that we are aware of. Step 2 is the world of smart contracts, in terms of knowing that I think that's more what we would see here locally first, is the development potentially of either tokenization or a smart contract that would develop and how that would impact the real estate industry. There's more discussions that occur, and Barry can talk more about that later on, for, you know, when he's here for that process, for what some of the, you know, the other parts of the, you know, real estate, the finance, the attorney side of the world is dealing with for those transactions, to know how they're looking at what the state laws are. When we have a strong trust industry in the state and a strong banking industry, it's one that, you know, 2+ years ago, we did a CLE for attorneys on the topic of blockchain, and that was the focus of the discussion. How are we involving our division of banking for dealing with custodianship of digital assets and developing those rules as it relates into South Dakota and promoting that for where it goes along with? And then the final part is, how do you deal with the replacement world of what our registers of deeds are doing? When we talk about the immutability record that goes in and knowing things, I mean, you can't change a digital record that goes with it, but you also can't beat the local register of deeds in a small county who knows every single person there. When it comes to dealing with knowledge of transaction and preventing fraud, knowing who owns every piece of property and knowing who's locally there is what we've already had for those protections. And our issue that we're seeing when trying to figure out, as these national developments go on, what could happen locally or what those steps are, we're trying to figure out that process. There's nowhere near enough generated on a real estate transaction for fees to pay for the conversion system that would go in with it. Is that something that, as industry pushes for it, is that an approach where there's going to be financing that covers the cost for that adoption throughout the state? Is that something that comes in the form of a bigger picture review of what we have going on with it? Our joke that we like to have on our approaches, we can't get agreement on electronic recording in the state to start with. We're nowhere close to blockchain in terms of where we're headed. But just because we're not there at that moment right now doesn't mean that as real estate professionals that we have to, you know, ignore what's happening. And that's really where our role has come in, of trying to stay as knowledgeable as what's happening and what's going on for us with the American Land Title Association, the Mortgage Banker Association, and others. What are these discussions, and then trying to distill that to explain it at a local level, and then also to discuss what that regulatory framework would be in South Dakota and what those changes would be to go with it.
So on the title side, with the title companies, what percentage would you say of the state are actually on board? Or it's not going to happen, we're not going to deal with it?
You know, right now it'd be a struggle to find a proponent would be the answer that would go with it. And the main reason being is, you know, we're used to doing things a certain way.
That's right.
And that's the starting point. It's not so much a reluctance to say that I refuse to do this. This is new. This is not part of what we're used to, and it's understanding what that role is. You know, one of the key issues that we discuss in the title industry when it comes to blockchain is the dependency on having good or clear title when it goes in. And our joke that we usually have is, you know, clear title is what our, you know, title commitment says it is, right?
Right.
That there's somebody who's reviewed that to make those determinations. In an actual, you know, abstract type approach, you'd have lengthy lists of entries for things that impact that. So where does that fit into that process? So I can say in a digital registry that I know that you own the property, I purchased from you, what the legal description is. We could input the prior policy, we could input the abstract and to show the exceptions of record that go with it. But understanding how that fits in is the education piece that's kind of currently ongoing.
I would think that in some ways you have to say, we're going to start from today. And what's happened in the past and what's on all that information is going to be in the past. So at least we can start. I mean, is that a logical way to go about it, you think?
That's certainly the discussions we're trying to figure out where blockchain fits in title insurance at the national level for some of those discussions of, are you building a register that starts with this transaction, starts the blockchain for what goes forward? You've put the abstract in there to say this is everything of record as of the date of that transaction. And then are you keeping two duplicate systems? Becomes the question. Is it everything from that point forward goes in to the blockchain database? Are you duplicating it? You know, what we usually point to is over in Minnesota, they have counties that are Torrens counties, which was blockchain long before there was the idea of blockchain. That you had to have this immutable system, you had a Torrens number, there was a record system for dealing with that, and it works. But it also is duplicate records in some counties, in terms of some properties are in Torrens, some aren't. Is that the same spot that we end up with? Because unless there's a mandatory type adoption, and you have lots of folks who are reluctant to start with, so then you have, you know, only when someone elects into putting things into the digital registry, does then the Register of Deeds office keeps track of those records, and if once it's in, can it come out? And, you know, there's not really an answer to that in the blockchain industry because the assumption is once it's in, it's always in. So that's where we kind of say, well, I think we have to first start with those answers and then figure out what some of those are for knowing what that regulatory framework will be once you build off of that spot.
And one of the things that I mentioned when I moderate, oh, here we go, I'm going to switch with you. Thanks for being here. One of the things that I do when I moderate is that I like to open up for questions pretty early so that you guys can help drive what we're talking about. So does anybody have any questions, first off, by anything that we've gone over at this time? Okay. So we were talking about title and blockchain and everything else. What are you seeing on the local level with the progress or lack of progress that's being made?
Interesting. I had a conversation yesterday looking at a couple abstract companies, and you know, certainly an abstract is a blockchain. It's, you know, it's the same technology. It's just you've got to run through the recorder's office as the key to make it all happen with the notary and everything else. So it's easy. I think it's an easy way to explain blockchain and what it can mean. But I would say, you know, we're not getting a lot of current adoption. I know I'm working with some folks in Texas that are more advanced in how they're utilizing blockchain on that side. You know, other areas I think of interest in the real estate side is utilizing blockchain for digital ID, so that you really do have a state-sponsored digital ID. Rhode Island, I guess, seems to be fairly progressive in that area. I know there's other states that have looked at that legislation. Have you seen any of that, or see where that?
We're talking about a little bit with, like, you know, Vermont. There's definitely some places that are starting to take more of an active role, you know, which for what you guys are doing actually leads me to another question. Are you guys working with other parts of the country? I know you said Texas, but I mean, is there a coming of the minds? Is there any type of an organization, anything like that?
So I'm with South Dakota Blockchain Institute that we formed. We're having a conference coming up November 2nd, so I invite everybody to keep your eyes out for that and come aboard. But I'm a member of the Blockchain Coalition, which is similar state organizations from around the country. We've got 38 that are represented currently. And so we're looking at legislation in all the other states and what are they facing and what are they seeing. You know, there's some that have been out in front. Wyoming, for example, has kind of made their stake in the ground on what they're doing. But as far as technology advancements, Washington State has the horsepower in the companies behind them with Amazon and Microsoft and everybody else there that they're certainly moving forward. The good thing about South Dakota is the South Dakota advantage. We can come together and get the people in the room that we need to make decisions pretty quickly. So I think it gives us a great opportunity to continue to be out in front of these issues as we put them in front of us. So.
Any questions? Anybody? You know, which leads me, getting people in a room. My biggest thing that I think is the issue is politics and having different municipalities, different counties, different states, because for it to be truly successful, then everybody ultimately would really have to adopt some type of system, right, Derek?
I think that's the key thing to think about. When we talk about anything in South Dakota, when it comes to real estate, specifically when it comes to recording documents, the part I like to stress is when we're dealing with registered deeds, you're dealing with a constitutional office that's elected by the local officials in that county. They may support each other and answer questions, but it's not like there's an association or a state agency that oversees and says, you're all adopting this. And we see that sometimes right now in the dealing with different systems that each is using. When it comes to explaining, are you a GovTrack office? Are you a Beacon office? You start at that point in terms of understanding what's the plugins that could go in for e-recording, or what's the plugin for an electronic CRV. And then you deal with the fact that some offices are staffed 2 days out of the week in terms of the amount of volume per transaction. So they're not exactly, leading the charge for what goes along with it. So one of the ideas that we've had for just in, trying to understand some of these discussions is we probably need a better framework for discussion, because it doesn't work to go to each individual office and say, hey, here's what we're thinking, what's your thoughts today? So in terms of trying to figure out what are those associations or what are those folks involved that can help out for your, local municipal governments that are involved in those transactions? Are there people like the Municipal League in South Dakota that can have those discussions, put on some of those presentations, discuss the ideas with them, and then start the feedback? Because we're not going to get anywhere from a discussion point of going to each individual registered deed and saying, blockchain, what do you think about it? The answer is going to be, I don't, or I don't want to. So that's kind of the spot in terms of it's the idea that we're not trying to say that we're forcing a change on anyone, because we're not. This is a discussion of a national trend and understanding what is the appetite or what's the ability to respond to it. Because what, my big concern is that we don't end up in a spot where kind of like the benefit of like an EU type approach is you form a framework at a much larger level. If we formed a national framework for blockchain, that's great, but are we swept up in it where now we've lost local control of developing what goes along with it and makes sense? And have we done that just by abdicating having the discussion that we don't have the ability to participate in what that becomes for the framework for South Dakota?
But why wouldn't that be a national type of a thing? I would think if it's going to speak to each other, basically, right, that you'd want something that has a similarity.
It's not so much that it's opposing to it, it's making sure that we're ready for whatever comes as a part of that. What, concerns me is that if you don't have these conversations, even if you're not thinking that this is going to be a part of your day-to-day life in the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years, everyone in this room is impacted by what happens with the developments of others pushing for this as a development stroke. Just because we, never thought that electronic mortgages were going to become common 20 plus years ago, doesn't mean that we shouldn't have discussions on it, right? It's that starting point of the world of what's happening in the development as it relates to blockchain technology means that it does impact everyone in the real estate industry. So now is the formative time to have those discussions, to know what we like, don't like, what we want to go towards, so we can be able to kind of form that consensus and kind of build those groups to deal with it.
You going to say something about it?
Yeah, I think, blockchain can scare people that it's a big disruptive force that's going to change things. And I've also been accused in discussing it that it's a solution in search of a problem. Where it can be applied internally as far as tracking information, and as we're getting into AI, which I don't know if you guys spoke on much before I got here, but if you're utilizing AI to make decisions for you, you need to make sure you've got a good database, a good data set that's being driven behind that. And blockchain is a great way to make sure you've got a good data set, because you're going to be able to see and track every piece of information that's in there. So when I'm thinking about real estate, one application that we're seeing, again, in Texas, that they seem to be ahead on the real estate side at least, is, utilizing NFTs for mezzanine financing for development. Giving people access to an area of finance that's currently only accessible by big institutional investors. So and then in agriculture and in mining, understanding what a piece of ground has. Obviously, when we're transferring title through the Register of Deeds office, we're saying who owns this, but who owns the next level below that, who has, we're looking at the CO2 pipelines, who has the easements, who has the big parcel of sticks that makes up the title to real estate, and can analysts and investors utilize blockchain to really understand what they have when they buy that and potentially sell those things off and the rights that are associated with those things. So, I hate to come in and say that this is a solution. I think it's a great tool that can be utilized to solve problems that we have. I don't think anybody in this room thinks that it's terribly efficient to record documents and transfer land. There's a huge industry built around it. We own abstract companies. We get it. We may be part of the problem. We try to be part of the solution. Attorneys, banks, and recording mortgages and all of those things. We could certainly make all of those things more efficient. And utilizing the technology of blockchain to do that makes a lot of sense because it can be immutable and completely transparent. You can't hide if it's transparent. You can't change it if it's immutable. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily trust that, but internally in our own systems, I think there's no doubt that we can do that and trust those things. And then as we expand them and use distributed, tables and ways to make sure that those checks and balances are there. The other opportunity I think we have in South Dakota is that we've got a lot of stranded energy, a lot of stranded renewable energy. So as far as the electricity utilized to back up blockchain, we've got a lot of opportunity here to do that in a way that can give us a great.
And people don't think about that, about the electricity that's needed, right?
Yeah, and it's getting more efficient. The technology is changing quickly, but it's certainly a big part of it. If you're gonna mine Bitcoin, you need electricity.
Yeah, you need a lot.
It's nice to get it, before it gets to the meter, and it's nice if it's renewable because there's certainly, a tag that we're destroying the environment by doing transactions this way.
Any questions for anybody right now? You have? Now's the time to ask those. So with that being said, with some of the challenges that we talked about, Eric, I'm going to start with you. When do you realistically think, how far are we away from this really being something that's really utilized?
I think the answer to that is when does the first big conversation happen is the starting point, was what I would say. Is when is the discussion for the stakeholders in this room and others sitting down and going through what the ultimate objectives are and really laying out what those barriers, because once you have that conversation, not just with the people who are following it, but those who aren't following it. And I, put that in the context of talking to your government officials as a part of this and bringing them in and listening to those concerns. That starts us down the path of coming up with what's the work plan to say, if this is what's happening, these are the issues, how are we addressing each step along the way? Is, just from practical experience, when we talk about changes, I relate it back to, dealing with the world of trying to deal with, electronic documents for real estate transactions. We adopted 10 years after other states have started the adoption spot, and we're 10 plus years into a slow adoption cycle because we didn't have, I think, a good enough conversation at the get-go to say this is what's happening, this is what goes along with it. If there's momentum for it, it's something that could be accomplished, I think, in a period of, well, we're talking about years rather than a decade for where we go to. But if it's a resistance spot where we're running into, instead of laying out problems and collaboratively solving them, and instead it's more of, constantly running into roadblocks, it's going to take longer. And that's where my, as I talked about, my concern comes in terms of if the industry's moving faster than the development of the regulation side of the state, we're going to run into a problem that goes along with it, where someone is so far ahead in terms of what they're doing, and transactions are occurring both on and off paper to some extent. How do we rectify that rather than, instead of saying at the beginning, we need to discuss these issues and come up with what the framework is for that approach, so that way when the transaction presents itself, the framework is there, rather than trying to develop the framework after the transaction already exists.
Very last question for you. What about on a national basis? When do you think this will You think we'll see this happening in 10 years from now, 5 years from now?
As far as putting real estate
Having real estate starting
transactions
to
on a
have
blockchain.
different components.
I mean, I think for the, the mortgage industry, it'll happen sooner than that, but that'll be a private tracking of, I mean, everybody looks at Zillow and understands that all the information that we have can be aggregated and put into one place. And so if, you've got to look at it is, do we need it in that respect? Because we've already got about 5 different information points to say that you own your house. And, so in some ways that is blockchain. That's a distributed technology that a bunch of people are coming together and agree that you own your house. I don't see it on a national level because, I mean, this is a local solution, a statewide solution. I think, what pushes it forward is, do we get additional advantages from it? If we're just trying to replace what we have, it works fine. There's been a lot of people doing it for a long time. There's a certain ceremony to the fact that we have, paper documents that we take down to the recorder's office and talk to them. If those recorders, we can't hire them, we don't have anybody that wants to be a recorder anymore, then we have a problem that we need to solve. And if we're going to solve that problem with this technology that we have complete transparency and immutability in, that seems like a fairly good solution. But I also think there is more that we can do, because we do need to understand what that real estate means beyond just, bare title. Understanding the environmental aspects of it, the soil quality, the, corn suitability ratings, whether there's minerals there, whether it's connected to an aquifer. I mean, there's a lot of information that you could put into place, and once you've built this system, you can add all of those things. So I think it does take a little bit of progressive solution making. It may come about because we just don't have anybody that wants to be a recorder anymore, and we just have to find a new solution, and this could certainly be one of them. So it'd be nice to think that we're moving forward for good reasons, but sometimes we need a crisis to make it happen.
Well, this is definitely something that's happening. I mean, we talk about it here, and it's going to continue to happen. It's going to get bigger. So the question is that, do you want to get ahead of this thing and be ready for it? Any of the students that are out here, everything I hear you guys talking about, all I think is opportunity. Because if you had some system, for example, that could be adapted by a lot of people, well, who put that system together, right? It'd be easier to take something off the shelf than to try to do it individually in different locations. But it will continue to change. It won't happen overnight, but when it does start changing, it will start happening very fast. So stay on it, keep listening. When you hear something about blockchain or real estate, stay attuned to it, because it is the future.
Thank you, DJ.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for who attended, who stuck through, who came. You truly made a difference. This concludes the 3rd Annual South Dakota Land and Lending Conference. We will start calling for proposals on breakouts next year, on keynotes next year, on some ideas. And so if you want to help out and be a part of the committee, please let me know, because I promise you we need it. And with all that being said, I know it's 3 o'clock. I know we got life going on, but we do have a special social hour sponsor, Old Republic Title, sponsored the bar for us. As we talk about the recordings and title insurance, I think the least they could do is buy us a few beers. And so with that being said, thank you. I appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next year.